So my name is David Cowton. I'm with the Capital Forum. We have a panel here. We're going to take another look at C-band. We've done 2 conferences on C-band. It's an issue of much interest to our readers as well as to the whole telecom industry. It's attracted a lot of attention. Basically, I assume most people here have some sense of the C-band. I'll just give a quick, very brief synopsis. Oh, wow, that just beamed up. C-band, it's basically 500 megahertz of spectrum from 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz. And is currently used primarily by satellite providers as a downlink to beam content company programming to broadcasters and cable operators and other pay TV operators, which they then distribute to their consumers. So it's kind of like a video distribution backbone to get programming throughout America. And it's basically used by the entire industry. But it's also seen as prime mid-band spectrum. Mid-band basically between the high-band spectrum and the low-band spectrum. And it has 500 megahertz, and it's believed that we can repurpose a significant chunk of that to 5G wireless service, which is obviously being rolled out and is looking for that mid-band spectrum because it's seen as the Goldilocks spectrum. It's got good coverage and good capacity both, whereas low band's better on the coverage and penetration side. The high band is particularly good on the capacity side, but doesn't have so good a propagation characteristics. That mid-band spectrum is particularly good for doing both, and C-band is where there's a significant amount of spectrum that potentially could be used for this. And that's created a lot of interest. There's a belief that if this spectrum, chunks of it are sold off, it could attract tens of billions of dollars. A lot of argument about how much, and there's a lot of variables. I keep hearing the $60 billion estimate. As best I can tell, that goes back to the Kerrisdale report from a year and a half ago, and I went back and looked at it. They estimated the whole band, 500 megahertz, was worth $75 billion. And then they said, well, 400 megahertz, that's 80%, so that would be worth $60 billion. Now, what we have on the table is the C-band Alliance satellite providers had proposed to auction off 280 megahertz by private auction. So you're looking at 280 of the 500 megahertz, which is a little over half. So even if you use the Kerrisdale numbers, then you're probably down under 45 billion to more like 40 billion. But of course, all these numbers no one knows. That's just the estimate that is probably most widely used out there. Others I've seen estimate the 280 megahertz could bring 50 billion. Anyway, but recently Chairman Pai surprised a lot of people and announced that he was proposing to do a 5G public auction of 280 megahertz of C-band spectrum starting by the end of 2020 with a guard band of 20 megahertz and the satellite services repacked into the upper 200 megahertz. And basically they're targeting at least an initial order for sometime early next year. So to discuss these issues, there's a lot of issues. We got about an hour and now a little bit less. We've got 4 speakers representing various points of view, and I'm just going to go right down the list. Right next to me here is Patrick McFadden, Associate General Counsel at the National Association of Broadcasters, who helps to develop and advance their spectrum and innovation policy. Obviously, broadcasters are a major distributor of programming. They do it free over the air, but they get the programming beamed to them. And then next to him, we have Vladimir Bouquet, Director of Spectrum Management Policy at Eutelsat, a C-band satellite service provider that was a C-band Alliance, or CBA, member until September 3rd, and they've since been advocating on their own. I would note CBA, we invited them to participate. They declined to participate, but we have Vladimir here, who they were a member of the C-band Alliance. Obviously, you can't speak for them at this point, but you obviously offer a very important satellite perspective here. Next to Vladimir is Hank Hultquist, AT&T's Vice President of Federal Regulatory, representing the company at the FCC on spectrum and wireless policy and various other issues. Just a housekeeping point, AT&T is an applicant in auction 103 of high-band spectrum starting next Tuesday, which is subject to certain restrictions, and so Hank can't talk about that auction. As best I can tell, I don't think anyone else here is participating in that auction. And then finally, down at the far end there is Alexei Malta, Senior Vice President and General Counsel of the Competitive Carriers Association, representing competitive wireless providers. They range from smaller to mid-sized to even some of our larger providers in the country. Alexi leads CCA's regulatory and legal advocacy before the FCC and other agencies. So we're going to have a basic format here, opening comments. We're just go. I actually want to start, I think, Vladimir, let's start with you since you're the satellite guys are kind of like, you know, the initiator of this. Make your opening comments, 3 to 5 minutes. Give us the big picture, the points you want to emphasize, and then after that, anybody can respond, and you can respond to each other as you go along, and we'll see if we get a discussion going. And to the extent necessary, I've got questions I'm ready to start peppering, and we'll try to reserve some time at the end for audience Q&A. So, Vladimir.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting Eutelsat to this panel. I think it's quite important to introduce our perspective regarding the C-band in the US. As you mentioned in your introductions, we were member of the C-band Alliance for a while, but we decided to leave beginning of September and to, I would say, propose some alternative solutions in the interest of, we think, the satellite industry and actually for the satellite operators. During my 3 to 5 minutes, I think will be 5 minutes, opening speech, I would like to focus on 3 points. The first one is a recent announcement. I think it was a big announcement on the structures and the next step for the C-band. Also, I will talk about the transitions because I think it's a key element for the success of this I think the auctions, but the use and the efficient use of the C-band for both the satellite operators in the remaining 200 megahertz, but also for the 300 and the development of the 5G. And last, I will briefly introduce the compensations model that we are advocating for the FCC to make sure that at the end it will be a win-win-win solutions between the satellite operators, the wireless carriers, and the FCC. So about the Chairman Pai's announcement, we are really comfortable with that, and we thought during the last month that deviations from the general purpose of the private auctions to the public one, and the Chairman announcements was in the direction that we were expecting, and we are very comfortable not only about the announcement but also the structures and the timeline. So the 280 megahertz plus the 20 megahertz of broadband, we understand that this is the appropriate balance, so it's difficult to go against, and now we decided to work in that directions, and we signified that to the Chairman Pine. I mean, my CEO visited FCC office a couple of weeks ago. I mean, ex parte is public, so it's not a secret, but we really insisted on the fact that we are really ready to work with the FCC to find the best approach to look at these transitions, to be quick, smooth for all the parties and the stakeholders invited in part of these transitions. In terms of funding, I will give more details after that, but we think that through the auctions model, and I will give you our perspective regarding the auctions models, we think that we need to find funding for both transitions, so making sure that the relocation cost to release this 300, because at the end will be 300 megahertz to be released from the satellite purpose, will be appropriately funded, and also the compensations for the relinquishment of our authorizations, market access or license, depending on the satellite grant access that you receive from the FCC. But anyway, we think that the 2 points to be funded is relocations cost and compensations for the relinquishments of the license. In terms of way to compensate the outcome of the auctions, we have heard a lot of things about the incentive auctions. We think that it's a bit complex, noting the specific structures of our license to work the incentive auctions that has been done for the 600 megahertz band. We think that the incentive auctions as done for the 600 megahertz band is very well appropriate for exclusive license or terrestrial license, where you have specific geographies and uniqueness, I would say, in your license. This is not the case for the satellite operators. To be clear, we have a kind of overlay of or layers of non-exclusive license to cover all the CONUS geographies. So the basic principle of the incentive, unless that's radically modified, for our perspective, are difficult to be implemented. But of course, we are open of any alternative solutions. And what we think is a classical public auctions, and to get some reserve or reserve charge required by the FCC to compensate the satellite operators. We think that in the transitions model that I will describe later on is the most straightforward, quick, smooth, and rapid way to move forward. About the transitions.
Kind of have to wrap up.
Yeah, okay, about the transitions, what we think is the satellites are the best positions to manage the transitions, they best know their customers, and they think that we think that having binding engagements between the FCC and the satellite operators is the best way to move forward and to have these transitions on time. That means that we don't need necessary transition facilitators, but if the FCC asks for that, and of course have the responsibility of these transitions, but use kind of third party, this third party needs to be experienced, neutral, fair, and not linked to any of the satellite operators, which would be part of the transitions. Regarding the compensations, we think that the compensations will be developed in 3 steps. The first one is kind of fixed incentive compensations for the relinquishment of our license. Second, compensations will be based on the transitions and the transition cost associated. And a last compensations is kind of incentive to have the transitions on time. And that could be subject to penalties if you don't perform your transitions as agreed with the FCC, as I mentioned, during our transitions process. So this is basically what we see as a main point to be working on in the couple of, or in the next months or next weeks at least, to develop proper proposals to fasten these transitions.
Okay, great. Patrick, why don't you go ahead?
Thanks a lot, David, and thanks to the Capital Forum for having me to talk about C-band, which is everybody's favorite topic. The central challenge of this proceeding has always been, and will continue to be, how to make significant spectrum available for new 5G purposes while protecting the backbone of the content ecosystem, which is how David very accurately described the C-band and the role that it plays today, providing video and audio content to nearly 300 million Americans. There are sort of 3 important sub-questions to that central question. How do we accomplish the reallocation? How much spectrum are we doing, and how do we manage the transition? With the chairman's announcement regarding the path he intends to pursue with the auction, I think we now know the answers to the first 2 of those questions in terms of how we're doing the reallocation. It'll be a public auction. How much spectrum? It'll be 280 megahertz of spectrum made available for 5G services with a 20 megahertz guard band, preserving the upper 200 megahertz in the C-band for continued content distribution. And then how do we make sure the transition works? That's a challenge that we still have to sort of figure out together with other stakeholders and the Commission. We think there's definitely an achievable path forward to allow content distribution to skinny down to that upper 200 megahertz. But there are a couple sub-questions there. One, how do we make sure we get the interference rules right? As I've said a couple times, and I'm sure Hank agrees with this, and other wireless carriers agree with this, it's really important that we wind up with a stable set of interference rules that allow the winning bidders in a public auction, who are going to commit X billion dollars, whatever the number is, to getting access to spectrum. It's really important they be able to deploy the services that they're paying for, and it's really important that our continued operations be protected. So we need a set of interference rules that work for the entire ecosystem. And second, in terms of managing the transition going forward and achieving that skinnying down from 500 to 200 for content distribution, that was a process that our members got comfortable with following months of discussions with the satellite operators. Those discussions between the operators and their customers included discussions about advanced compression technologies, certain loading commitments, and certain commitments regarding the launch of new satellites. So from our perspective, as we look to ensure a successful transition, the continued participation of the satellite companies is going to be critical to the success of that transition. So any auction model that the Commission and other stakeholders are looking at should be one that hopefully will involve the satellite operators and make sure that their incentives are correctly aligned to ensure a successful transition.
Go ahead. Hank, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Thanks, David. Really, I think David and Vladimir and Patrick, you've all done a really good job of sort of laying out the importance of C-band, both as the linchpin of the distribution of video content and its potential importance for a mid-band spectrum for 5G. Also, the complexities involved here with respect to how this gets done. How do you have the right interference rules? How do you ensure that the transition is well planned and executed? I guess, so I'm not going to repeat all that stuff. I agree with what you guys said. AT&T's perspective here is that we need an auction that is fair and transparent. We need, there should be compensation to the existing satellite providers for surrendering their rights and for the important role they will play in the transition. And that the transition should be well planned, executed, and overseen by the FCC. That's kind of our big picture perspective on the most important things that need to happen here. I think rather than repeat what you guys said, I think I will talk just very briefly about why the transition is so complicated. And ultimately, what it comes down to is you have an ecosystem where you have satellite providers who are selling C-band services to one group of entities, let's say the programmers, companies like Warner Media, and they in turn have another group of entities who are operating thousands of earth stations all around the country. And everybody has to be properly incented and properly motivated to make this transition work. So the satellite operators, they have to launch new space stations. They have to have a plan for repacking their customers into a smaller number of transponders. The programmers, they have to change the way they do business today. They're going to have to adopt more modern compression technologies, change some modulation schemes that they use. They're going to have to likely get rid of the transmission of standard definition video. And then you've got the earth station operators who they're the ones who are going to have filters installed. They're going to have to also install the appropriate receiving equipment for all of their content providers. So it is a very complicated series of steps that will have to be executed, and no one party can execute all of them. And so this is why it's so complicated and why it has to be adequately planned and overseen by the FCC. I suspect the rest of the things I want to say will come out in questions, so I'll stop there.
Alexi.
Sure. Thank you, David, and thank you to the Capitol Forum for having me. I agree. The comments so far have really nicely teed up what's at stake in this band. From CCA's perspective, we represent a range of carriers from small rural carriers with fewer than 5,000 customers up through regional and nationwide carriers with millions of customers. But many of our smaller members are serving rural America. Many of them are the only wireless network in part or all of their footprints. They're really serving their local communities. And from our perspective from day one, I fully agree that this is a critical band. It's one of the few mid-band opportunities to get a big swath of spectrum available. We've really wanted to maximize the amount of spectrum we can repurpose for terrestrial wireless services, get it into the marketplace as quickly as we can, but being mindful of the fact that there are incumbents and they do need to be accommodated. And we want to have it auctioned through a fair, transparent process. So we have really supported the chairman's announcement of an FCC-led public auction. 280 megahertz of spectrum is far better than what we've been talking about for a lot of the last year and a half. And now we are very focused on making sure that we implement this auction in a fair and transparent way. I think smaller carriers just want to have a fair shot at getting access to the resources they need. We need to focus on a band plan that makes sense to really facilitate deployment of 5G services. And the transition, as Hank and others have said, is critical. It is very complicated. We are mindful that it does have to be done carefully. We are fully supportive of compensation and indeed incentives to satellite and end users to help clear the band. To the extent that fiber can help be a part of that for some end users, we would support that, because fiber, in addition to helping facilitate a transition and clearing, also has a variety of side benefits, such as deploying more fiber into rural America and backhaul for wireless services. But we are very supportive of trying to have the balance of getting the spectrum into the marketplace as quickly as we can, while being mindful that there will be end users that will remain in the C-band and continue to be served either through satellite or through alternative means, and we want to be mindful of doing that carefully and properly.
Okay, just check real quick, did either any of you guys who spoke earlier have anything you wanted to respond to what the other people said? Yeah, okay. At the high level, I think there's a lot of agreement conceptually on kind of what's trying to be accomplished. It's when you get into the details. And actually, I think I heard all four members say something to the effect that you support some sort of incentive compensation for satellite companies, and some of you, even Alexi, you just mentioned also for users and potentially, I guess, Earth station operators. I'm not, obviously the devil will be in the details of all that. I guess, so is there any sense, do any of you have, this is a little bit of a variation because I heard everyone basically agree we need some sort of incentives. Is it pretty well understood that's the direction the FCC is going to have some sort of incentives? I've heard at least one of the commissioners, a couple of commissioners have kind of obliquely talked to this. Is there any real fight, or is it a possibility that the FCC would just try to force the satellite guys into the 200 megahertz and finance their costs? Are we, in other words, here's the question, is it really about how to structure those incentives, or is there still a serious debate over whether there will be any incentives beyond costs? Does anyone have a sense of that?
So I don't want to speak for the FCC and say what they have on the table and what they don't have on the table. I think our concern is that if the incentives aren't properly aligned here, then you run the risk that the transition will not happen on time, which could mean that either wireless carriers who spent millions of dollars in the auction don't get access to the spectrum on time, or it could mean that the video ecosystem gets severely disrupted. So my concern would be, without the proper incentives here, this thing may not work out right.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Hank was just saying. I mean, for us, we are in a constant dialogue, and I will not speak on behalf of the FCC, but we are in a constant dialogue to have a rapid and proper transitions in place to benefit for in the benefit of the satellite operators and the wireless carriers. So service continuity on our side, deployment of the 5G on the other side. The incentive and the compensations will fasten and smoothen this process. So I think it's the interest of everybody to find the right compensations and the right incentives to get a win-win scenario, as I mentioned in the introduction.
And I'll add, I think Hank articulated very well in his opening remarks what some of the challenges around the transition are, and the various different interests in maintaining having a successful and stable ecosystem at the end of this transition. And that's going to be a really complicated process that's going to involve the active participation of the satellite carriers. We tend to think the best way to ensure the active participation of the satellite carriers is probably to make sure that everybody's incentives are aligned to getting to a successful and stable outcome.
Yeah, and let me just add, so I also would not speak for the FCC, but just to note that on Capitol Hill, we also continue to see a variety of draft bills that propose different uses for the proceeds of the auction. From our perspective, from the wireless carriers, our members, we'd like to see as much spectrum cleared as possible. So we are mindful, of course, that there are many interested parties that would affect, the incumbent satellite operators, the end users. So from the beginning, we have never objected to both reimbursing appropriate costs of the people that will be affected by a repack, and even to the extent that there is incentives to clear as much of the spectrum as possible. We think whatever we can do to maximize the amount of spectrum that's repurposed for terrestrial wireless services, the better. So we do not object to any both compensation of costs and appropriate incentives for the entities that will be affected by this. David, at the outset, you talked about some large numbers on revenues. I'm not going to hazard a guess on what the numbers will actually be, but I do think that there's a real opportunity to meet lots of different goals here. So to appropriately compensate the end users, and then if Congress directs that there be some, return of some of the revenue to the Treasury or even used for rural broadband, all the better. That'll be up to Congress.
Okay. All right. So it sounds like everyone believes you need to either have incentives or get the incentives aligned. If we're specifically talking about financial incentives and starting with the satellite providers, because they're the current license holders or holders of the authorizations to use the spectrum, it seems like there's kind of two basic paths, and there could be variations under each. One would be to have an incentive auction, and I think, Vladimir, you talked a little bit about it in your opening comments. And the other would be to create some sort of other structure for some sort of incentive payments, not through a strict incentive auction. Can any of you address what you see as the prospects for either of those or both those two paths? The strengths, weaknesses.
I think sort of both are options, right? This could be structured as an incentive auction or just as a forward auction with a mechanism for new licensees to provide funding that would be used for costs and incentives. The only question I have on an incentive auction approach really is timing. We would like to get the spectrum into the marketplace quickly. To the extent that a sort of one-time forward auction is a faster process, then I think that brings some benefits. And I do think there are structures where legally there are some precedents where you could structure it as licensees, as a condition of their licenses, paying some money into a transition fund or to compensate the costs that are affected for the end users and the satellite operators. So I think both are viable options, but we're also mindful of trying to get this done quickly, and to the extent it can be done, by the end of 2020, all the better. If an incentive auction can be done quickly, great, but I'm more of the view that a single straightforward forward auction may be a faster path, but open to any of the options as long as they're done in a timely manner.
And I think I basically agree with Alexei. I think there are actually, at least theoretically, three options here. One is the two that were just talked about, where you have an ordinary forward auction with a requirement that winning bidders, in addition to their the money that they're bidding that goes into the Treasury, that they have a separate obligation to contribute toward the funding of the transition and the necessary incentive payments. Another is an incentive auction, which need not necessarily include a reverse auction. I'm not talking about auction 103, but I will say auction 103 is an incentive auction without a reverse auction. And then another one that I have heard people speculate about is whether you could design an overlay auction. I think the challenge there is that bidders in the auction will want to know ultimately how much they're actually paying for their spectrum rights. And I think that makes, you would have to come up with a pretty clever overlay design to ensure that they actually had that information when they were bidding. So I think those are, at least in theory, the three options.
Yeah, okay. We are, as Eutelsat, we also have the same analysis about the three options. And as I said in my introduction, the incentive case for us is not really obvious as it was implemented in the past. And because time is running and the idea is to have these auctions by the end of next year, we do not see in practice how we can develop, agree, and implement all the new type of incentive auctions by the end of next year. So we are not necessarily in favor of that. The forward auctions looks with some reserve charge, as explained by Alexei and Hank, are really, I think, the most appropriate options if we have this reserve charge duly implemented and having all the compensations and the transition costs included in this reserve charge.
Yeah, one of the problems with the incentive auction key problem is because the spectrum is shared, no one has exclusive spectrum that you can kind of compete with the others on to sell off your piece with the lowest bids. So you got all four current incumbents using the spectrum for C-band 500 megahertz, and actually you have four other smaller operators who have the rights, and as I understand it, use C-band, but they don't have U.S.-based revenues. So you have really 8 satellite providers that could be involved, and they all have rights to all 500 megahertz. And incentive auction, you need to have competing providers. And so you do have an issue where if some don't participate, you would basically have to just force them out, and that is a problem. If you don't go the incentive auction route, well, let me just ask this: is there anyone here who thinks I heard a couple leanings towards seemingly not doing incentive auction because it would probably be too complicated and take too long? So, is there someone here who thinks the incentive auction is still a very viable path, and kind of any thoughts on how it might be structured, if it is?
Sure. So, I mean, I guess I would say I'm not ready to take anything off the table. And so I think to have an incentive auction, I think you're correctly identified. The issue you would have to resolve is you have a group of providers who don't have, they share their rights. And so inevitably you would have to modify their licenses in a way that they now have some kind of exclusive rights. And I think there are models for doing that. So I guess I would say, I think it is possible to have an incentive auction. Whether it's possible, whether it extends the time frame unduly, I don't know. But I think these decisions have to be made quickly.
Well, I think the core problem is that holdout issue, and you have to clear. Chairman Pai's made clear he wants to auction off 280 megahertz with the 20 megahertz guard band. And then how do you get people to actually bid in a way that's meaningful and not just bid to the moon hoping to get gobs of money? So you'd have to have an incentive to kind of drive the price down. And I'm just going to throw this out. I just thought of this morning. Does this make any sense whatsoever? Where you basically have all 8 providers come in with numbers, and whether you do it one sealed bid or you do it kind of on a gradual basis, you come in, and whoever comes in ultimately, or the first time, however it's done, with the lowest bid would get that percentage of money of whatever the auction is. And then the second lowest would get a little bit less than that, and the third and the fourth and the fifth on down to where you're getting down to much lower. So everyone would have an incentive to bid, and you'd put a number on it, and then you'd obviously have to have a forward auction under which it would clear. Does that make any sense whatsoever, or am I just like smoking crack this morning or something? I don't know. Is that even theoretically possible? Not that I've seen this, but it just...
Yeah, I think there's a version of that you could work out. The question, I think, is the one that Vladimir raises, which is how complicated and how long does it take? But yes, I think there are options here, but they have to be worked out.
And I think that the proposals we made is more straightforward and more and less time consuming, and also cover number of questions or elements that you mentioned, because we split the compensation and the incentive based on the fact that you have a relinquishment of your authorizations, and then you have an efficient transitions in for the satellite operators who have customers. So I think we can split, and you can imagine where we want to drive the discussions. We can split really the compensation in 2 steps. The first one is relinquishment of your authorization. Second step is to have an efficient transition. So it means that if you have or don't have any customers, you can fit in one of the 2 elements and then fasten the process. Ultimately, what we want is to have certainty, clarity about what will happen, and I really concur to my other colleague that sooner as we have directions, better will be for everybody.
Okay. Let's say you don't do an incentive auction, and you're going to do these incentive payments into some sort of fund. What would be the basic precedent or authority? I've heard increasing talk about the FCC's emerging technologies precedents under which they've cleared spectrum in the past, that you have the carriers essentially, the winning bidders pay for the cost. The question is, could they also pay for some sort of incentive payments? Is that kind of the main way it's likely to go if you don't have an incentive auction? Or is that a viable path? the emerging technologies precedent?
I mean, I do think that that is one of the key precedents where there is an example. There's 800 megahertz rebanding where there was a payment of costs for transition. So I think in the record at the FCC, there are a number of legal arguments that lay out precedents in which licensees, the new licensees, in addition to paying the money that they pay to acquire the licenses, are also paying into a reimbursement fund to compensate the people affected for clearing the band. And I think that would have to, the question is, how do you structure that in a way that covers the appropriate costs that come up here, which is costs that Earth Station users may incur, whether they need to implement new filters, if there are transition costs for some end users that want to move to fiber, that would be a cost as well, and a cost that would reflect an appropriate compensation to the incumbent satellite operators for relinquishing a portion of their spectrum. And I do think that could be structured as a cost and a reflection of their expected return over time. And I think there are precedents to have done that. But that's I think the structure of it would be essentially that bidders, licensees pay money to acquire a license, but as a condition also are going to be paying into a cost reimbursement fund for all of the affected current users of the spectrum.
Any other thoughts on that? Okay. In terms of timing, and obviously everything is still up in the air here, but C-Band Alliance had proposed under their private auction proposal that they could clear basically 100 megahertz in 46, I believe, or 50 of the top markets in the country in 18 months after an FCC order. And then they could do the rest of the 280 in 36 months after the auction. Do you think that's kind of the framework we're working off, however these incentive payments might be structured? But is that still basically the framework for the timing, or would there be ways to adapt that to the incentives? In other words, maybe that would be the full incentive, but if you didn't meet that, you would get less of the payments. And if at some point, you didn't clear, you get no payments. Can someone speak to how the timing of clearing interrelates to potentially these incentive payments?
Yeah, and actually in our proposals, we propose to include some penalties if your engagement with the FCC is not performed in the right timing. So in other words, we have a binding engagement, or what we propose is all the satellite operators have individual binding engagement with the FCC. We have a transitions plan and a roadmap, and the incentive at the end of the transitions will depend on how fast you will do it, and if you delay these transitions, then you will get some penalties. So this is also an incentive to do what you say to the FCC. So I think is absolutely crucial. On the timing, yeah, we are. What we see is if the auctions is performed by end of next year, mid-2023 for releasing the 300 megahertz, so it's more or less 3 years, or in this time frames looks appropriate. And for releasing the first 100 megahertz, definitely in mid-2021 or in 2021 could potentially be a first step for this tranche of 100 megahertz, but definitely mid-2023 looks the target or the deadline for these transitions if we do all the job appropriately.
I just want to note, I think our concern is just that we want to make sure we don't introduce any tension between doing the transition quickly and doing it correctly. Certainly we have no objection to any kind of incentives around speed. We just want to make sure there's some guardrails built into that process so that if those speed-based incentives are threatened, shortcuts aren't taken that could threaten content distribution. But I don't think that's an impossible problem to solve.
Okay. Well, what should the role of the incumbent satellite providers, whether it's C-Band Alliance, 3 members, Eutelsat, or the other 4, Vladimir, you kind of touched on this. I've heard a lot of talk sometimes in bills and in the FCC docket about having a transition facilitator. Is there a need for kind of some entity, an independent entity, as a transition facilitator? And if there is, why wouldn't it just be the FCC itself?
Okay, you read our last ex parte. This is exactly what we are pushing. We think that the satellite operators have the expertise and the relationship with their customers, and they better know than any other third party what is the requirement from their customers. So we think that having a binding engagement for each satellite operators with the FCC is optimal, I would say, structures to run these transitions, because we will have the direct link with our customers. We will all know how to perform it, or at least have better information than any third party. And that should be done under the supervision or overseeing by the FCC. However, we understand for the day-to-day review or analysis, some transitions, what we call monitor rather than administrators, might be appointed by the FCC to look at the transitions, the milestone, identify if there are some issue, because in the transitions everything is not necessarily smooth, and we need to have also one dedicated, I would say, interlocutors in case of tensions, but definitely the supervisions and the responsibility of the FCC in front of the satellite operators need to be the key element for these transitions, and the satellite, the transition facilitators or monitor will be here just to manage the day-to-day work, and this is how we see that. In the past experience, I have some friends working for years and years on the transition in the 800 megahertz band. We think that this is not what we want, and everybody wants the spectrum clean, service continuity for satellite operators, but also having on the right time for the deployment of the 5G. So having transition administrators counting the pennies which you spend for the transition is not what we want. And what we really look at is to have an appropriate transition plan with an estimate cost, I would say, stamp or approved by the FCC or an entity which show that it's reasonable and appropriate, and then run these transitions. And of course, this transition monitor will be here to look at the roadmap, the timeline, and the milestone that you propose, but not really to impose and make any preference on the solution that you will propose to your customers. And the last point on these transitions monitor administrators, whatever the word says, you need to be fair, transparent, experienced, and not, I would say, link or having interest in one of the parties involved in this transition.
Go ahead, Patrick.
I would just add that. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I think regardless of who formally serves the role of transition administrator, the participation of two entities is going to be key. One, the FCC, and two, the satellite operators. We're interested in having an active FCC enforcement and oversight role in any transition to make sure that the process rolls out smoothly and ensure that commitments are upheld. But also it's important to remember the way that we got to the numbers we're talking about, 280 plus 20 and the upper 200 preserved for content distribution. The way that we got there was following extensive negotiations with the satellite operators. So we definitely need them to be a part of the transition going forward.
So I guess the only thing I would add to this is there is a lot of touches that are going to involve not just the satellite providers and their customers, the programmers, but also the Earth station operators. And the satellite providers have no relationship with the Earth station operators. And the Earth station operators have relationships with every programmer. So they have relationships with all the large programmers, the small programmers. So there's an awful lot of touches that are going to have to happen with them, involving filters, receiving equipment, and it just strikes me that this cries out for a really good project manager, for somebody who can say, what days are you going to have people available to assist with this operation that's going to have to be done? And whether that project management function is something that the satellite companies collectively hire someone to perform, or it's something that a third party is hired for, is questions that I think are open. But I really do think that this project would benefit from having some expert project management as being part of it.
Yeah, and I think I agree with all that's been said. From our perspective, we obviously don't have a window into the specifics of the satellite industry or even the end users. We have been part of a proposal, a joint proposal that proposed a transition via fiber, which cleared up even more spectrum. I do think that there are some end users that want to have an option of whether they transition via fiber distribution or if they move to compression technology. I think, as Hank said, and all of them have said, there are multiple interested entities here. There's satellite operators, programmers, MVPDs, and distributors. I think all of them have a role to play in the transition. We have not committed to any particular model for what that transition should look like. But I agree. I think there is a role for a facilitator to help make that happen with FCC oversight, and the goal of doing it smoothly, quickly, to the extent that there are opportunities through transition to even potentially maximize even more spectrum availability. That's great, but we'll have to see how that plays out. And I think if a neutral third party can have a valuable role to play in bringing the parties together, and if we can structure incentives to make sure it happens smoothly, all the better. But we have not sort of focused on any one particular model that process has to take.
Okay. All right, we need to talk a little bit about how the auction proceeds would be distributed, and that's kind of where we've been having way too much agreement here. Maybe we can get more disagreement. I don't know, or maybe you guys are going to be all diplomatic on this. But anyway, can you talk about what the proceeds split between the U.S. Treasury and the satellite companies and everybody else should be? Now, the Wicker-Thune Senate public auction bill would mandate, if it were passed into law, that the FCC deposit at least 50% of the gross proceeds from the auction into the U.S. Treasury. It said at least 50%. Any thoughts on, the prospects about that legislation and becoming law? I see it was just put on schedule, I believe, to be marked up soon in the Senate Commerce Committee. But even if it doesn't become law, does that send a signal to the FCC, particularly given that Senators Wicker and Thune are two very key Republicans in the leadership there? You know, the chairman of the Commerce Committee, as well as the number two senator in Republican leadership. That basically you need to deliver at least 50% of the proceeds to the Treasury.
So I said early on, AT&T had, we had a kind of an interest from every perspective of this proceeding. This may be the one we don't. But I certainly think that the satellite companies, when they're looking at sort of, okay, so the new status quo we're living in is that there's going to be a public auction, I think they should certainly view that bill as a data point when they think about what there can possibly be achieved here, and as they think about what their objectives should be. How they treat it as a data point, I don't have any advice for them. But my view of this is, you never in DC, you never expect there to be legislation that's passed. But the longer this thing takes, and the more, if whatever the FCC decides ends up going to the courts, I mean, the more time this takes before the FCC reaches a decision, the odds of a legislative solution go up.
Anyone else want to discuss the proceeds split between? There's all sorts of granularity on the private side, but just the basic split between the Treasury and everybody else. How you look at that?
Actually, when the private auctions was discussed and still on the table, we made a proposal about this 50-50, and that was based on the private structures of the auctions. So now we are looking a bit differently because we are in the public auctions, and we think that we need to have a proper incentive and compensations based on what I call the satellite-based spectrum valuations. In other words, I mean, when you look at the auction and how will be structured the auction and how the mobile industry will bid for this auction for the 5G, I mean, we are mixing two different things. They are looking on exclusive terrestrial right interference-free, and we are overlaying authorizations on the CONUS, on the US. So we think that linking are correlating the outcome of the auctions with the compensations might not be the right approach for us to move forward. In other words, we need to see about, from our perspective, spectrum valuations from a satellite usage, the appropriate compensations to be done. And this is what we are now exploring. We don't have yet finalized our proposal, but this is what we are exploring. And decorrelating the two aspects of the auctions for the 5G and our compensation, I think will help us to have better clarity, certainties, and visibilities about the way to move forward, including the transition, the compensations, and the relinquishment of our rights.
Any other thoughts on the split between the Treasury and everybody else, and how that might be resolved? Okay. What about within whatever goes to the Treasury, in terms of the satellite side and all the C-band users? Should the small satellite operators be included in any incentive payments, and should there also be incentive payments for everybody else who's in the C-band ecosystem, whether it's the programmers or the Earth station operators?
So I'll start on this, although I'm sure Vladimir has strongly held views on this. So from the content distribution side, our focus has really been just on ensuring the continued integrity of content distribution. So we haven't taken a view on compensation to programmers or other kinds of end users. We just want to make sure that whatever process is put in place here, we're made whole at the end of the day.
Actually, in our proposals, we, by default, include the SSO because the structure of the compensation is split in two parts, as I mentioned earlier. One is on the compensation for the relinquishment of your authorizations, and so far the SSO, they have these authorizations, and another compensations based on the transition and how you perform the transitions, and the transitions is linked to the fact that you have customers. So this also one way and one directions we decided to take to make sure that we have visibility for all the actors and stakeholders in this. And as I said, we want to have a smooth, rapid, and clear process. And I think, by having such kind of structure in terms of compensations will help to have this process moving smoother.
Just to be clear, AT&T does not have a position on how any proceeds should be divided among the satellite companies.
Yeah, neither does CCA. It's not so much our battle as to how the proceeds are used. I would say we do favor any process that at least has some clarity, reduces litigation risk. We're in favor of trying to make sure we have a path forward that meets everyone's needs, but we don't have a particular view on what the right split is among proceeds.
Okay. We're starting to get short on time, but I do want to get in two more areas really quickly before we open it up for the audience. On forward auction, there actually seems to be a fair amount of agreement. AT&T and Verizon have both stated they want just basically a traditional, the same or similar format that was used in the 24 gigahertz auction earlier this year. And U.S. Cellular actually was here a couple months ago, and their representative said the same thing. So there seems to be kind of some movement towards there among three key potential bidders in this auction. Is it your all sense that is where we're likely headed, or have you seen anything else that people are? I heard Hank, you mentioned the overlay auction. Is that still a strong possibility, or is it more likely just to be this kind of traditional clock auction?
I have no idea, but I do think it's likely. Whatever type of auction, I think it's likely to be a clock auction, just because the software is available. It will not require significant modifications, and so that will enable the auction to move forward as quickly as possible.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think from the smaller carrier perspective, what we have wanted from the very beginning of this process is a simple, clear, transparent process. That is what has led us to believe that an FCC-run public auction is the best way to go. Alternatives in the record, prior to the chairman's announcement, had all seemed quite convoluted, complex. I thought that some of the principles that a number of carriers had laid out several weeks ago that included a straightforward process run by the FCC, including things like no package bidding, no combinatorial bidding. There were a lot of principles in there that do reflect, in my view, a straightforward, transparent, clear process. And I think that's what smaller carriers have always wanted, is just, if it's clear and transparent and simple and straightforward, that gives everyone an opportunity to have a fair chance to get what they need.
Okay. One other question on forward auction. CCA, Alexia, you guys have said no carrier should be able to acquire more than a third of the C-band spectrum in any geographic market. AT&T at one point said you didn't believe there should be any restrictions. I'm guessing that's still AT&T's position. Would you all care to discuss that issue? Why, Alexi, why you think we need some sort of 1/3 cap, I guess, on spectrum or thereabouts? And Hank, if you all still are opposed to any such restrictions.
Sure. I think we've long believed that a robust, competitive wireless marketplace is good for consumers and good for competition, and that the FCC does have some levers it can use through things like auction design to help promote a competitive marketplace. So something like a 1/3 aggregation limit on the spectrum in any geographic area strikes us as a pretty modest and reasonable way to ensure a more competitive marketplace. And we think that would be appropriate here as well. And that would increase the opportunities for everyone. There are a lot of different carriers out there that are looking to get access to the spectrum. It is particularly valuable mid-band spectrum. So we just think that's one fairly modest way that the FCC can structure an auction in a manner to promote competition.
Strong-
So you correctly
modest.
identified that AT&T has not supported auction-specific aggregation limits. I think in the context of a potential C-band auction, there's obviously other spectrum that some carriers already hold, which I think is significantly more than the 1/3, which is similar spectrum. And so I don't see the policy benefits of having an auction-specific aggregation limit here.
Okay. And then on process, the FCC, or at least their staffers, on the day Chairman Pai announced he was going for a public auction, said their basic plan was to have an item for the commissioners to vote on early next year. They wouldn't commit to January, but obviously January 30th seems like at least the initial target. To do it by January 30th, they'd have to have a draft by January 8th, I believe, because it's 21 days. They release it, but they have to circulate the day before. Any thoughts on the prospects for the FCC meeting that target of a January 30th, even though they haven't committed to it? How difficult is that going to be? And what type of decisions could be made, and what might need to be pushed off in the future through further notices on further details? Just get into how things may lay out over the next year. And obviously the FCC will decide these things, but at least give us some sense of what you all believe would be the right course here and the likelihood of starting in January. Hank, I am going to kind of call on you because AT&T's been very vocal in pushing for certain process.
Sure. So I think, unless I hear otherwise, I'll assume they're going to try to work toward an order in January. It may be that ultimately they feel like they need a little more time, but for now I'm going to assume they'll try to work toward January. I think they can adopt an order that, identifies some fairly big picture things like, what's the band plan, what's the geographic license size, address some of the issues that Alexi teed up. We're not going to have combinatorial bidding, whatever. So I think they could identify sort of some big picture things. I do think there are items they can't quite resolve yet. Patrick mentioned earlier the importance of having clear technical rules to protect against interference. I think on that they should propose some rules, and then they could then later adopt those rules. So I think they could propose rules on that. And I think they could also adopt some procedures to begin to gather information that's necessary for the transition plan. So there needs to be information gathered from the entities I've been talking about, the satellite operators, the programmers, and the earth station operators, about what changes they'll need to make to achieve the transition. So I think those are things that they could get kicked off in an item in January.
That all sounds right. I mean, I think the issues that remain outstanding and that the FCC can clarify are auction procedures, band plan, technical parameters, and the transition plan. And probably the technical aspects and the transition plan are the ones that still have the most work to be done. I think the FCC probably could propose, as Hank suggested, and propose a band plan, propose auction procedures. And then some of the technical work and the transition plan, I think, are going to take some more time. I hope that the FCC will see comment on a lot of these issues. I think that will be important process-wise and to ensure the legality of the process. There's more work to be done, obviously, and this is not all going to be solved, I don't think, by January, but I think if it's a January or February item, there is a lot that the FCC could tee up and see comment on.
Yeah, as you said, we completely share the view from Hank and Alexi. We think that for the technical element and the transitions, I would say procedures, we will need further notice and discussion and exchange to really finalize the best structures to have certainties, clarity, and efficient transitions and security in the future in terms of service continuity for our case.
Is it possible, even if they get something out in January, or let's say it takes till February, you may have, I've heard talk that maybe the auction, if it's not some sort of really complicated incentive auction, that they might be able to get the auction details nailed down a little quicker than some of those transition issues and complexities. Is it possible we could have two orders after the January, February one maybe by late spring, early summer, on all the auction stuff, so you can get prepared for the auction starting in December, and then have some sort of final, transition order by October, November, so you know what you're bidding on? Is that a conceivable, plausible way this might play out?
So the transition is important for the auction in terms of if you're going to use the transition costs as part of a reserve price. And so you have to estimate, have a reasonable basis for estimating what the costs of the transition are. And so that's important. But yes, I think these things can operate in parallel, so that as long as when you get to the point where you're going to have the auction, you've completed all the work, you're good to go.
And final question, how optimistic are you that the auction will kick off by December of next year? Just go down the line. Just give me your sense of optimism.
I'm hopeful. I think that I do think that's feasible. I think there's more work to be done, obviously, but I think we should all be working towards that goal. And as we sit here today, I don't see any reason why it couldn't happen. Chairman has seemed to be of the view that they want to try to kick something off by the end of the year. I think that's a great goal, and I think we should all be working to help achieve it.
Yeah, I guess I would say I am very optimistic that the FCC will do what it needs to do to have the auction start this year. I think there are wild cards that they don't control, including whether parties decide to go to court and whether that drags things out. And so I don't know. I'm not going to put any probability on that. I'll just say I'm optimistic that the FCC will do what it needs to do to start this auction in 2020.
Yeah, I also think that there are fair probability that we will have these auctions by 2020, end of 2020, and all the work that we discuss will be taken as a high priority from the FCC and all the parties to find an appropriate solution.
I'll just echo what Hank said. There may be some things that are outside of the FCC's control, and it can't control those things. But I think I have enormous confidence in this chairman and in the FCC staff who are working on this item to move heaven and earth to try to make this happen as quickly as possible.
Okay. I want to throw it open for questions. We got at least 10 minutes here. Jake told me we could go to 1. If necessary, we could go to 1:05. So we got 10, 15 minutes. Go ahead, Teddy. And do we have a mic? Because then it helps the transcript.
Why don't you just rephrase my question? I don't know. There's some, you guys talked about some of the ways to think about how to ensure that incentive payments are fair. And some of the proposals in the record are very rigorous in terms of, okay, authorization. You're paying for the authorization. There's customers. What about the duration of the remaining life of the satellite? That is actually tied to the license. The license is good for the remaining life of the satellite. Obviously, you can propose to get re-up, but that captures a lot of the costs of the satellite providers. Is that something that should be involved, or are there any other things beyond that we should be looking at in terms of like, okay, well, what is a rigorous way to assess based on costs, commitments, etc. What is a fair incentive payment? Because I thought that's been one of the more interesting aspects of some of these filings.
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to repeat all that, but yeah, what would be a fair incentive payment? There's been some filings that have been more rigorous, and Teddy noted, what about the question of the duration of the remaining life of the satellite? Should that be a factor that should be included? Should there be other factors that are included? I know Utelsat, you all have talked about some principles,
Yeah, in our previous proposal, when the private auction was on the table, we included these lifetime durations in our proposal about how we can spread the proceeds. Yeah, I think that's an important element. And when I was mentioning previously authorizations, of course, I was thinking about authorizations in terms of capability to transmit over the 500, currently the 500 megahertz, the targeted geographies where you can deliver some services, because you need also to delimit the orbital arcs where you consider that you have transmission over the conus, and also the live duration, which we do believe it's also an important element. So we are currently refining, readjusting, and retuning our proposal because of this important announcement. But definitely these elements should be taken into account in the way to incentivize and compensate the different stakeholders.
Anybody else want to respond to that? Other questions? Teddy.
I'm getting back to the other people that are involved in the spectrum, and why is it that only the satellite companies are going to get an incentive payment? I mean, it's like everyone else is just going to not take this money, this added money that they would be getting. Why is that? And especially for the programmers and the earth stations, it's kind of annoying, right? You're getting repacked. You got to install these filters. I mean, you get your costs covered, but you don't get any kind of like nuisance payment or something for doing this. But like, why are you like? I just guess I don't get it. Like, why would you turn down free money if someone's asking you? Like, again, just in terms of like a fair way to do it. Why is it fair for the satellite companies get billions and you guys get nothing?
So just real quickly for the transcriber, why would the satellite companies be the only ones to get incentive payments? Why wouldn't programmers and earth station operators get more than just their cost paid for? They're going to have to do a lot of rejiggering of their systems and equipment. It just doesn't, why would they turn down free money?
So I'll go on record as saying we'll never turn down free money. I think that's a safe assumption. But I also think that, our focus, again, is really just on preserving the content ecosystem. And I think it's important not to, as we continue to try to play a productive role in this process, I think it's important not to introduce elements that could be seen as counterproductive by decision makers. And we really, at the end of the day, just want to make sure that we're made whole. If decisions are made to make us more than whole, I don't think we're going to say no to that, but that's not what our focus is on.
And ask you, if you're willing to do it where you're just made whole, shouldn't that be good enough for everyone else? Because you keep saying, well, there's got to be an incentive to get these people in alignment. And as far as I can tell, the only thing that doesn't bring them into alignment is that they want money. And you're saying it's good enough for us to just get our costs covered, but it's not good. Like, why are they special? Like, you guys are not special. Or like, why are they, I guess I don't understand.
I think Teddy's basically saying if the broadcasters at least, it's good enough for you all. The most important thing is to be made whole. If you get more, great, but that's not your focus. Why isn't that good enough for others? And I assume he's basically referring in particular to the satellite companies.
Yeah. So this is actually, I think, a really good question. And my view of it is that all the parties who are involved in this transition should be fairly compensated for the disruption that is caused to them by this transition and for the costs that they incur with, it shouldn't be let's squeeze them. Let's make sure that it's an accurate kind of way to estimate and approximate the costs they incur as part of the transition. I do think that the parties who are giving up rights, they're not just installing new encoders, they're actually surrendering their rights to use this resource. I do think it's appropriate for them to get included in those costs, whether you think of it as opportunity cost or however you want to conceptualize it. I do think both from kind of the perspective of a static view of, in this case, they're giving up rights, they should get something from it, but also more generally, I think if parties who have licenses, let's say spectrum licenses, see that the FCC and Congress and everyone is open to a system where they can receive compensation for surrendering those rights. That's kind of what the incentive auction did with broadcasters, that is a good way to promote more efficient use of spectrum. And so I view that as a good thing.
Yeah, I share that. I mean, we started this from a perspective of what's the best way to maximize the amount of spectrum that gets cleared for terrestrial wireless services. And realizing that there are incumbent entities that have, current use of the band, we ended up joining on to a proposal whereby the video marketplace would essentially use some of this funding to transition to fiber, which many of them viewed as a more successful long-term plan. Whether or not we still think fiber could be a helpful part of a transition, I think part of what you're raising is maybe just one of terminology, whether you call it incentives or costs or compensation. I think our view is that in order to free up as much spectrum as possible, it's reasonable to provide appropriate compensation for those who are affected. And as Hank pointed out, various entities are affected in different ways, and so what that compensation looks like may vary. But I think that's just been our view, that if there is a shift and an opportunity to free up spectrum for a more efficient use and in a use that benefits consumers, and people are affected by that, and there's potential to compensate for those that are affected, that could be a reasonable use of the funding and result in a net positive all around.
Vladimir, did you want to answer Teddy's question? Why aren't you good with just getting your costs paid for?
Well, actually, my colleagues, Alexei and Hank, just clarify at this point, but I can reinsist we consider that the relinquishment of this of part of authorizations over the 60% of the total capacity, more or less, is a fundamental change of our authorizations, direct deprivations of our investment. We have transponders which are now visible to the CONUS for operations will be done off due to these reallocations, and this fundamental change also need compensation, and not only on the transitions, but also the deprivations of our assets.
Well, it's about 1 o'clock. It's 12:59. Jake, should we do? Does anyone have a further question? All right, last question. I think we can make room for one more question from Teddy.
Last item, revenues from this industry. You mentioned opportunity costs. Should there be a look at how much money this business generates for the satellite companies on an annual basis, and look at that as well? Should that be a factor? I understand. I think the point about the authorization is a really good one, and sort of the size of that, what that's worth, seems to be an interesting, issue. Should the revenue from that be taken into account?
I mean, I'm going to repeat what I said earlier. We think that the compensation should be somewhere decorated from the outcome of the auction for terrestrial. I mean, you're absolutely right. Between terrestrial exclusive authorizations and non-exclusive use of the spectrum for satellite, there are a number of variations, and we think that the compensation should be based on the satellite-based spectrum valuations. That's really how we see. And one of the reasons we think that is we'll give clarity, visibility, and certainties for our industry, and this is what we are looking for.
Just to make sure I understood, Vladimir, you speak great English, but there's a couple words there. Are you saying
You don't
the
like my French accent?
No, I speak no French, so God bless you. Are you saying compensation should just be based on the valuation? I mean, you said transition costs as well as the authorization costs,
Yeah.
and Teddy throws in revenue and lifetime of the satellites and all sorts of things. But you're saying it shouldn't be based on the auction, the
On the
forward
outcome
auction.
of
It
the
should
auction.
be based on the valuation of the spectrum and whatever opportunity costs.
Exactly.
Okay,
Yeah, this
like
is-
an absolute number, essentially, assuming enough gets raised.
Yeah, and I mean, what we want is to decorrelate as much as we can the outcome of the terrestrial auctions. So what will happen at the end of next year if everything goes smoothly from the compensation that we
So
expect.
de-link that is that what you're saying?
Yeah,
Kinda-
decorrelate.
What's the word?
Decorrelate or delink.
Decorrelate?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. That was what I was having a hard time with.
You
Sorry
really
about
don't
that.
like my French accent, huh?
No, it's just. Okay, I think anything else? I think we'll call it and time for lunch, everyone. Okay, Jake. All right, great job, guys.